In the next 24 hours, you will almost certainly feel like you've already lived a moment right before it happens. It happened to a Canadian neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield in 1953, standing over an open human skull in Montreal. The patient was awake, fully awake, talking, because the brain itself feels no pain. Penfield touched an electrode to one spot on the surface of her brain, and she said, "I've been here before. I know exactly what happens next." So, it's your turn. The feeling is happening to you this week. Do you trust it? Here's the man who started chasing that question, Wilder Penfield, born in Spokane in 1891, and by the 1950s, running the Montreal Neurological Institute. He had one habit that never changed, case after case, for 3 decades. Every time he found a live spot on the cortex, he pinned a small numbered paper ticket directly onto the brain, like a librarian tagging a shelf. Over his career, Penfield did this kind of awake mapping on more than 1,000 patients. By the end of some surgeries, a single brain wore more than 20 of these tags, a paper city built on top of a living mind. And number 11, on more patients than Penfield expected, didn't just twitch a hand or spark a smell. Number 11 made people relive entire moments, conversations, rooms, a song playing on a radio that wasn't there, which should have been the discovery of the century, memories wired to a button, except none of what those patients described had ever actually happened to them. Whatever that ticket was switching on wasn't a memory at all, and it's still switching on inside you. Here's the term for what almost happened on that table: déjà vu, French for already seen. A philosopher named Émile Boirac coined it in an 1876 letter, then spent decades trying to prove it was a message from a past life. Boirac wasn't some fringe figure chasing a curiosity. He was rector of the Academy of Dijon, spending real academic standing trying to make déjà vu a legitimate subject instead of a superstition. Boirac never proved that, but by 2004, psychologist Alan Brown at Southern Methodist University had combed through a century of case reports and landed on a number. About 60 to 70% of people will feel it at least once. Brown didn't run one experiment. He pulled together more than 50 years of published studies into a single analysis, checking which old explanations actually held up. So the mystery isn't whether it happens to you, it's what your brain is doing in the half second it happens. And at a different clinic in a different decade, a very different kind of patient walked in, and everything about how we understood déjà vu collided with him. His name was AKP, a retired engineer studied by memory researcher Chris Moulin at the University of Leeds in 2005. AKP didn't feel déjà vu once in a while. He felt it constantly. So constantly, he refused to watch the news because he insisted he'd already seen every headline. One man's déjà vu never switched off, and that turned out to be the accident that finally cracked the case open. The academic side of this got almost bureaucratic. By 1983, a psychiatrist named Vernon Neppe had cataloged more than 20 separate déjà experiences, each with its own French name, like a wine list for the brain. Déjà vu, already seen; déjà vécu, already lived; déjà senti, already felt. There is, genuinely, a whole corner of this field that argues about which committee gets which one. There's even a documented opposite, jamais vu, a familiar word or face that suddenly looks completely wrong. Chris Moulin ran a study where volunteers wrote the word door by hand, over and over, until it stopped looking like a real word at all. Most people got there in about a minute. None of that taxonomy explains AKP, though, the man from Leeds who felt déjà vu without end. Chris Moulin's records on AKP describe something specific. He wasn't just feeling familiarity. He was certain enough to skip doctor's appointments because he insisted he'd already been. Moulin's team even tested him with general knowledge questions AKP had never seen before, and he still insisted every time that he already knew the answers. That kind of non-stop déjà vu almost always traces back to one place, the temporal lobe, the same region Wilder Penfield had been tagging with paper tickets 30 years earlier. And here's the part that got buried. Penfield's own case files list dozens of these temporal lobe déjà vu patients, but in the books that made him famous, they barely got a paragraph. because admitting the brain could fake an entire memory broke the theory Penfield actually wanted to sell. Some historians who later reviewed his papers have argued the tape recorder story was simply the easier one to fund and to publish. His theory was simple, and it made him famous. Stimulate the right spot, and the brain plays your past back like a tape recorder, perfectly in order exactly as it happened. Textbooks repeated that tape recorder idea for decades. It was clean, it was quotable, and it was wrong. Because starting in the 1970s, a psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus began proving the opposite. Memory doesn't replay, it rebuilds itself every single time you reach for it. In one of her most famous experiments, Loftus showed that changing a single word in a question, smashed instead of hit, could make people misremember how fast a car was going and even recall glass that was never there. In a later study, 1995, her team convinced roughly 1 in 4 participants they'd been lost in a shopping mall as a child, an event that never happened, complete with invented sensory detail they swore was real, which means the ticket Penfield pinned onto that cortex in 1953 was never playing a tape at all. It was catching the brain in the act of building one, live, in real time, on the table. So if memory isn't a recording, what is your brain actually doing every time it hands you a scene that feels like it already happened? The answer didn't come from a hospital. It came from a laboratory word list 60 years later in Scotland. Before Scotland, though, there was Colorado and a stranger experiment. Researcher Anne Cleary put people inside virtual reality mazes secretly built to copy the layout of a maze they'd already walked, just rearranged. Cleary started with small pilot versions of this at Colorado State University around 2012, then scaled up to full virtual reality headsets a few years later. People couldn't consciously spot the copy, but a striking number of them felt déjà vu right as they turned a corner they'd technically never turned before. Here's the part that should make an ethics committee a little nervous. Some of them also felt like they could predict what was around the next corner, and they couldn't. Not any better than a coin flip. So déjà vu wasn't remembering the maze. It was recognizing the shape of the maze without the memory attached, a feeling of knowing with the knowing part missing. By now, 3 separate labs, Montreal, Leeds, Colorado, were circling the exact same conclusion from 3 different directions, decades apart, without planning to, which meant it was time for someone to actually catch the moment déjà vu happens, on purpose, inside a brain scanner. Because if you could trigger it on command, you could finally watch what the brain does in the half second before you say, "Wait, I've done this before." Nobody had managed that. Not in 1953, not in 2005, not in Colorado. Then, in 2016, a researcher in Scotland found a way to fake déjà vu on demand, using nothing but a list of words, and what his scanner caught wasn't a memory turning on at all. Researcher Akira O'Connor at the University of St. Andrews built a version of a classic false memory trick called the DRM word list method. The method is named after the researchers who built it, James Dease, back in 1959, and Henry Roediger and Kathleen McDermott, who refined it in 1995. Show someone words like bed, pillow, blanket, dream, and later ask if they heard the word sleep, and most people swear they did. It was never on the list. O'Connor used that same trick, then asked a second question. Does this feel like déjà vu? And people said yes. A false memory that never happened still produced the exact feeling of already having lived it, which meant for the first time, someone could switch déjà vu on inside a brain scanner on command. It was a small study, just a couple dozen people, but the pattern inside those scans was consistent enough to change the whole conversation. But it gets stranger, because of what the scanner actually lit up. Everyone expected the hippocampus to fire, the part of the brain that stores memories. If déjà vu is a memory glitch, that's where the glitch should live. It didn't fire, barely a flicker. Instead, the frontal lobe lit up, the part of your brain that double-checks decisions, that catches contradictions, that is basically your built-in fact-checker. Which means déjà vu isn't your memory glitching, it's your memory checker doing its job, catching a false alarm before it can fool you, and flagging it so hard you actually feel the flag. That reframes everything about AKP, the man who couldn't stop feeling it. If déjà vu is a fact-checker firing, AKP's fact-checker wasn't broken either. It was stuck in the on position, sounding a false alarm at every new moment of his life, which is a genuinely disturbing way to live. Imagine never being able to trust that anything is actually new. And that's the part that 20-plus name taxonomy from 1983 never really solved. You can name a feeling 20 different ways in French and still not know what turns it on. Meanwhile, back in 1953, a numbered paper ticket was still sitting in an old case file in Montreal, filed under a footnote. Ticket number 11, the one that made a woman relive a conversation that never happened to her, 63 years before anyone in Scotland proved what it actually was. That's not a footnote. That's the whole discovery sitting there the entire time, waiting for the right question. And here's the part that should actually unsettle you. This isn't rare. Roughly 60 to 70% of people get this fact-checker alarm at least once. Most people just never ask what it's checking, which means your brain is running a background process right now, comparing every new moment to everything it's ever known, and every so often, it catches something close enough to trip the alarm on nothing. It's not broken. It's working exactly as designed. The unsettling question isn't why does this happen to me? It's how often is that fact checker catching something and just not telling you? Because a fact checker that only sometimes tells you it caught something isn't just watching your memories, it's watching everything you're being handed as true all day, every day. Memories, headlines, messages, feeds. And that background process doesn't only get fooled by your own brain misfiring. It can be fooled from the outside, on purpose. There's a decades-old finding, completely separate from déjà vu research, that proves it. Psychologists Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Topino ran an experiment back in 1977 at Temple University. They read people a list of statements, some true, some false, 3 separate times, spaced weeks apart. It didn't matter whether the statement was something a person could actually verify. Familiarity moved the truth rating either way. By the third read, people rated the false statements as more true, not because the facts changed, because the statements had simply become familiar. That effect has a name, the illusory truth effect, and it runs on the exact same familiarity signal that gave you déjà vu. Same background process, same fact checker, just fed something manufactured instead of something accidental. Nobody connected these two findings for almost 40 years. The memory researchers and the déjà vu researchers were reading each other's footnotes without noticing the overlap. In 2018, researchers Gordon Pennycook and David Rand at Yale tested this on real fake news headlines and found that even one prior exposure, just once, scrolling past it, was enough to make people rate it as more believable the second time. One exposure, that's the whole trick. You don't need to believe something the first time, you just need to have seen it. Later replications found the effect barely moves based on someone's education or how carefully they say they normally check facts, which brings us back to that operating table in 1953 and the numbered paper ticket that started all of this. Everyone treated that moment like proof the brain was misfiring, a glitch, a hiccup, a wire crossed. It was the opposite of a glitch. It was your fact checker catching a lie your own memory almost told you and stopping it in time for you to notice. Déjà vu isn't your memory breaking. It's the one time you get to watch your memory checker win. Every other time it catches something, you never even know it happened. No feeling, no flag, just a fake fact quietly let through. And you are being fed those fake facts constantly by something that has read the same research you just heard. Every app that shows you the same claim, the same face, the same headline more than once isn't doing that by accident. Repetition is the cheapest way to make something feel true, and your fact checker only catches the version wearing a memory. It doesn't catch the version wearing an algorithm. So think about the last thing you reposted or agreed with a little too fast this week. You didn't check it because it felt true. It felt true because you'd already seen it, and your brain mistook that for proof. That's the same circuit, the same fact checker from 1953, the one that made a woman say, "I've been here before." It's just gotten a lot more exposures to work through, a lot faster with a lot less silence in between, which is why, 63 years later, ticket number 11 still matters. It was never a window into your past. It was a warning light, and most of the time now, somebody else has learned exactly how to turn it off. Penfield never lived to see any of this. He died in 1976, 13 years before anyone could scan a brain and prove what Ticket 11 actually was. He spent his final years writing historical novels instead of neuroscience papers, quietly, without ever getting to correct the record himself. But the ticket's still there in a filing cabinet in Montreal, numbered, dated, and right. So, it's your turn again. The feeling is happening to you again this week. Do you still trust it? Now you know what's actually answering. You still trust the feeling. That's exactly the plan.